Welcome, everyone. My name is Dana White. Today, we have the Myth Salon with Phil Cousineau. And I've got to tell you, getting Phil into the Myth Salon, it's just, I couldn't imagine anybody more aligned with what Pacifica, the study of myth, everything. I mean, this is just like, it's a wonderful, wonderful synchronicity. Today, we have a little bit of a concern going on globally. And one of that is that sometime this year, we're going to hit 8 billion people on the planet. Now, the population of the planet has doubled in the last 50 years. It's a scary thought. And you combine that with climate change and then diminishing resources and the difficulties of the political situation with instability everywhere. It's a monster scenario. So I would like all of us just to give a moment. I'm going to ring the singing bowl, and let's have a moment of silence for all of us. Because as we've come out of the pandemic, we lost quite a few people globally. We lost more than 1 million people in the United States. And it's a tragic scenario. But we need to gain a foothold on our mindfulness and develop a sense of what we're going to do in the future. So, this is a poem by an Egyptian poet named Constantine Cavafy, and it's called Ithaca. As you set out for Ithaca, hope your road is a long one, full of adventure, full of discovery, Lastrygonians, Cyclops, angry Poseidon. Don't be afraid of them. You'll never find things like that on your way as long as you keep your thoughts raised high, as long as a rare excitement stirs in your spirit and in your body. Lastrygonians, Cyclops, wild Poseidon, you won't encounter them unless you bring them along inside your soul, unless your soul sets them up in front of you. Hope your road is a long one. May there be many summer mornings when, with what pleasure, what joy, you enter harbors you're seeing for the first time. May you stop at Phoenician trading stations to buy fine things, mother of pearl and coral, amber, ebony, sensual perfume of every kind, as many sensual perfumes as you can. And may you visit many Egyptian cities to learn and go on learning from their scholars. Keep Ithaca in your mind. Arriving there is what you're destined for, but don't hurry the journey at all. Better if it lasts for years. So you're old by the time you reach the island, wealthy with all you've gained on the way, not expecting Ithaca to make you rich. Ithaca gave you the marvelous journey. Without her, you wouldn't have set out. She has nothing left to give you now. And if you find her poor, Ithaca won't have fooled you. Wise as you will have become, so full of experience, you'll have understood by then what these Ithacas mean. So I'd like to turn this over now to my partner in the Myth Salon, Dr. Will Linn, with whom we forged this in my living room 5-6 years ago. The pandemic hit, and suddenly we went online, and 40 or 50 people turned into several hundred people. It's been a magnificent journey that still continues. Who knows where we're going? We have our Ithaca in mind. And our Ithacas continue to happen as we discover them along the way. So Will, why don't you introduce everyone, and then we'll get the show on the road.
Thanks, Dana. I didn't know you were going to be reading that poem tonight. There's a lot I want to see if I can try to tie together before we get started. For me, I first heard that poem when I was at Salon as a guest of the Joseph Campbell Foundation, and Robert Walter, Bob, gave us that poem, read that poem to us right at the very beginning. And in my own book that I'm working on now, I connected it to, I reflected on that moment and connected it to something that Dennis said to me that I cherish. He said to me that a mentor once said to him, "May you not get there till the end." And I am the person that needs people to say that to me all the time. So I value that and cherish that very much. And it's really special that you decided to read that poem tonight. I think about, of course, what we're talking about tonight, the myth of Sisyphus, the endless effort to try and reach that Ithaca at the top of the mountain, and how hard it is, and how important the journey is over the destination. And that story is incredibly important to me. I fault it for my seizures. I started having seizures around that particular story. Very special. It's a very special conversation for me. I'm really looking forward to, and it's absolutely not lost on me that, look, I host a lot of stuff. I've done radio shows and TV show now and all this stuff. And I know all about Phil, and I've known all about Phil for a long time. And it's really special for me to get to be in an event with Phil and in this conversation. So with that, I'll go ahead and move into our introductions. I'm very much looking forward tonight. You all know Dana White, host of the Myth Salon, producer, publisher, contributing member of Pacifica's Myth faculty, and he's just coming back from Europe. So welcome back, Dana. My name is Will Linn. I host a TV series on mythology for ZDF and Sky called Myths, the Greatest Mysteries of Humanity. I work with artists and I'm the founding chair of the General Education Department at Husson College in the LA Center Studios. Dr. Dennis Patrick Slattery is Distinguished Emeritus Professor in the Mythological Studies program at Pacifica Graduate Institute. He is the author, co-author, editor, co-editor of 30 volumes, including 7 volumes of poetry and 1 novel. His latest collection of essays is The Way of Myth, Stories, Subtle Wisdom. His paintings, poetry, blogs, and book titles, as well as upcoming events, can be found at DennisPatrickSlattery.com. We're joined tonight, I believe for the second time, by Dr. Rosalie Bouck, who is a freelance scholar and educator who teaches classes on story, mythology, and modern culture, and embracing narratives of feral femininity. Rosalie holds degrees in political philosophy and mythological studies with an emphasis on depth psychology. Her doctoral research examined the pivotal role of myths of femininity and the world of indigenous Mesoamerican cultures. Her teaching and work strives to find new ways to honor and listen to diverse, underprivileged perspectives in order to help us move past colonial practices and towards a more vibrant and just collective future. And Phil Cousineau is a writer, photographer, filmmaker, storyteller, lecturer, writing and creativity consultant, anthologist, quotologist, and an accidental aphorist. He has published more than 40 nonfiction books, earned over 20 documentary film scriptwriting credits, and contributed to over 50 other books. His work has won dozens of international awards and been nominated for many other awards, including an Academy Award and an Emmy Award. As a travel leader, he has led art and literary tours all over the world. Currently, Phil is a co-writer and host of Global Spirit, which plays nationwide on PBS and Link TV and streams around the world at linktv.org, which I will again post into the chat in just a moment. He's a guest host on New Dimensions Radio, the longest continuously running radio interview show in history. Cousineau is a fellow of the Joseph Campbell Foundation, a member of the board of directors of Sacred Sites International, and is one of the founding mentors of the Past publishing program at Book Passage in Corte Madera, California. Phil lives with his family on Telegraph Hill in Word Mad North Beach, San Francisco, California. Welcome, Phil. Welcome, everybody. I'm looking forward to tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those kind words. Thank you, everyone, for organizing all of this, for bringing us together. This is, I think, we're the last hurrahs of the pandemic, so we're all still getting used to this Zoom world. But let's make this work. I'm used to dashing back and forth on a stage, shooting hoops and so on in front of the group, so I feel a little constricted, but I am so exercised about this particular topic that I'm sure we will make this work together. I'd like to begin perhaps in an unusual way, and that is to cite the two moments that really inspired this latest book, my mythopoetic effort at looking back again at to me, one of the most powerful and timely Greek myths of all, and that's the myth of Sisyphus. So I want to begin with, of all things, an unusual book, but one I highly recommend to everyone. I'm going to be doing a lot of this. We should all be promoting books, not just ours, but others as well. This is the great Polish poet who just passed away in the last couple of years, Zbigniew Herbert, who wrote a beautiful collection of kind of portraits of the mythic heroes called The King of the Ants. And in here, he writes a piece about the great god Atlas, who is very important to our story, by the way, in which he says, because of the pen of Albert Camus, Sisyphus has become an allegory for our times. When I read that during the pandemic, it struck a nerve with me. And I've come to believe so wholeheartedly in the great poet Robert Lowell, four-time Pulitzer Prize winner, who once described the effort of writing as being ready, soul ready to catch an image. And because I'm such a big baseball fan, can you tell with my shirt here, that whole notion is an invigorating way to think about writing, that the images are coming to us perhaps from the dream world, from the headlines of the paper, and the poet, the writer, the creative person is the one who is ready, eyes open, heart dilated, you might say, to catch that image. So that image in Herbert struck a chord with me because I've loved this story since I was a kid, as you will see with the slides that I'm going to show in a few minutes. Flash forward to 2010, so not that long ago, a few years ago, when I was leading one of these annual art, literary, and mythological tours around Greece, and found myself in Corinth, and decided, actually for the first time since I was there and my group was ready. If any of you have led tours, you know this feeling where everybody's spirit is alive and ready for these kinds of images. And so I came out with the myth of Sisyphus because, as only some people know, not many, he was king. He was a king, a mythical king of Corinth in ancient times. Documented sometime around the 8th, 7th century, some say later. So I tell this story, which has moved me since I was a kid. I've loved it in all the various renditions, from the classical playwrights to Ovid, especially Ovid's rendition. And as I finished, I then treasured that moment. You all probably remember where you say, all right, everybody take a breath, go fetch some water. It's Greece, it's hot, so let's grab some water. And as my group dispersed, I happened to look over at what looked to be probably a 500-year-old olive tree, gnarled, beautifully barked. And leaning at the base of the tree was an old leather journal. And my first impulse was, oh my gosh, somebody in my group may have left that behind, or maybe a traveler earlier today. And being a good guy, exactly, well, being a good guy, I went over to pick it up so that I could maybe hail somebody down who was looking in his or her backpack for a missing journal. And as I reached down at the base of the tree and actually touched the journal, the wildest thought came to me, that it had been left behind by Sisyphus himself. Who knows where these ideas come from? But in the spirit of Lowell and the spirit of being a poet, you have to seize that moment. This is what the old Greeks called the Kairos moment. And they had a phrase that said, if Kairos appears, the god of synchronicity, the god of sacred time, seize him swiftly. That was actually an adage in old Greece. Don't wait, don't think, I'll catch this tomorrow. I'll write about it tomorrow. No, no, no. Seize him swiftly. Kairos is even portrayed with wings on his wrists, wings on his hip and on his ankles, which means he's always flying, whooshing past us. So I seized that moment and immediately wrote down a few notes. Why, as you guys know this routine, why if? Go into the if. Go into the why question. Why would he have left a journal behind? Why? Because he has always felt misunderstood. Why would he have felt misunderstood? Because he thinks his name has been sullied over the years, that the wrong version of what really happened with Zeus and Asopus, the river god, people forgot that version and they seized onto another version. And it was up to him to set the story right. Well, that's a good beginning of a book idea, right? Everybody else has gotten this wrong. You name the topic. That is a good place to start. We can talk about Joe Campbell's response to this in the past, where instead of just dismissing everyone else, all the scholars, all the poets who came before you, the creative writer digs in immediately and tells the story as it should have been said all along. So I kept that notebook and then I reopened it in the nadir of the pandemic, the darkest night of the soul. It was probably spring 2020. If you can flash for a moment, take a breath, remember what it was like 2 or 3 months into the pandemic when we were all getting locked down. Imagine the immensity of that image, that mythology. And it was in one of those darkest nights where I was actually sitting right here on this couch in our living room on Telegraph Hill, when I pulled out that old journal from Corinth where I had taken some notes. What if Sisyphus wanted to set the story straight? And I began that night and I wrote at white heat for the next few months, retelling the story in the mythopoetic fashion. Will, you know a lot about this, but also in the spirit of Camus, who in his famous essay, and this is the French version that I bought in Paris when I was writer in residence at Shakespeare and Company for 7 months in the late 80s. And the owner, the legendary George Whitman, said, Cousineau, you need to read this in French. So I read this magnificent piece and obviously was inspired, but then I wanted to know the story behind the story. Don't all of you? There's a story, but let's look for the root system behind it, the impulses, the force field that is behind every memorable story. So because I was there in Paris and I learned from George himself that Camus had been a member of the French Resistance. I went to the French Resistance Museum there in Paris. It's on the Champ de Mars. It's very close to their Museum of War, ironically, right? And I found out that early on, when the Nazis occupied Paris and then eventually all of France, most of France, he and Sartre joined the resistance. And he founded a resistance newspaper, actually called Combat. And he kept writing on this. Sartre was in the beginning, then Sartre left later. Camus kept at it. But then he noticed one thing early on in the occupation, and that was a word that's at the heart of our exploration: despair. A feeling of isolation, a feeling of being at the crossroads of either collective history or personal history, and the enormous question of suffering. This is at the heart of the myth of Sisyphus and most drama, by the way. There's a magnificent series about Shakespeare Uncovered. And in every one of the analyses of the plays, the commentator, the host, talks about how Shakespeare's plays are always about the struggle between love, desire, and suffering. Love, desire, and suffering, one way or the other. And so Camus responded to this despair that was sinking into the French themselves, but especially the resistance movement. Why? Because so many of them were being shot, sought out, assassinated, and then if the French resistance did anything about it, let's say took out a Nazi soldier, the reprisals would be even worse. So he was in this position that all of us on the panel are, and I hope many of the people listening in tonight are. What do you do when you feel like you are in a major soul crossroad in your life? You only go into the personal, which now, as we know, is a little questionable because it often gets, the confessional becomes sentimental. Or do you reach for the archetypal? Do you reach for the collective story? And the story goes that in the moment of his deepest despair, the myth of Sisyphus came back to him. And he wrote this 5-page essay with that title, the myth of Sisyphus, in which he reworked it. He is looking at the nobility, not the futility, but the nobility of Sisyphus's struggle. And his conclusion, which I then reread right on the heels of reading about Camus, going back to the story of Sisyphus, probably April, May 2020, in which this now famous last line, "We must imagine Sisyphus happy," just took my breath away. Which, if you know James Hillman's work, he has this wonderful story about the etymology of aesthetics, which is a study of beauty, which is that the lungs are constricting. Aesthesis, the old Greek word, aesthesis means you gasped. Something took your breath away. It could be a political realization. It could be an aesthetic, a romantic one. And I write about this in my version of the story, the novel, and also in my new book, Who Stole the Arms of the Venus de Milo? If it doesn't take your breath away, it ain't art. And that is then my motivation for telling this story. Because there's another translation of that famous last line where he actually writes in French, il faut imaginer, which in another translation actually means something very mythic and very significant. It is necessary to imagine, rather than this kind of the staid translation, which is, we have to think of. That's not what Camus actually said. He's actually saying we have to imagine, or it's necessary to imagine Sisyphus happy. That then is back engineered in my book into this story, while I feel that this is an allegory, as Herbert said, for our time. It's an allegory about the question of the futility of our efforts, political efforts, romantic efforts, artistic efforts, whatever those might be, versus what I believe the ancient Greeks saw in the story, and many artists from the 20th century onward have been seeing. And I'm talking Virginia Woolf, Carl Jung wrote extensively about the myth of Sisyphus, and everyone harkens back to this notion of repetition is at the heart of life. And then we are in William James territory, where we begin to think, what is your attitude towards having to do something over and over and over again, as Sisyphus was condemned to do? I will tease this out in just a minute. As someone who had to work in a Detroit steel factory, I remember the perils of self-pity, being in a steel factory for 4 years, 60 hours a week, but also playing semi-pro basketball, the absolute necessity of repetition, working on all these books, all these films. If you are dismayed by an editor saying, Dennis, you need to go over that again. Dana, we need another edit of that TV series. We need to go back to that radio interview. We need to do it again. If that question stymies you you're in the wrong field. And in this sense, I've been teaching the myth of Sisyphus for my writing and creativity classes for so many years. And all I have to do is show a few images and people get it immediately. The backstory helps, of course, but the image of pushing, shouldering the boulder, as I call it, up the hill, and then arriving at the top. And remember, the gods say, if you tip it over, Will, if you tip the boulder over, then we will pardon you and you can go back to Corinth. But of course, that doesn't happen as we know it. There is no final version of anything, from our work on the environment to marriage issues to creativity issues. The whole meaning is teased out in the story by Sisyphus's attitude towards this eternal struggle. So, do we have the film clip first, Dana? I'd like to show you a very brief film clip. It's only 2 minutes long, and it's made by a Czech filmmaker named Marcel Janovic, who created this animated film in 1974 and actually won the Oscar for a 2-minute animated film. And I love to show it because it's stark. The sounds are hellacious in every sense of that word. But as you're watching it, think about your own visceral psychological responses to this. Does it seem futile? Does it ring a bell? Have you ever had to do something in your own personal life again and again and again? Dana, please. Thank you, Dana. Thank you. So just take that in, hold it for a minute. As we set up the slides, I now want to show just about 20 minutes of slides because it's so important to get the images, the actual images that have been created in response to this story over the last roughly 2,500 years. Some say 3,000 years. That's how old this story is. And we have images from the vases, stone. Some of the sculptures go back again to the 8th, 9th century BC. And we have many modern images as well, including the New Yorker, where the Sisyphus image is considered to be one of the most popular, one of the most perennial, one of the most evergreen images in New Yorker cartoon history, which is significant, as we will then tease out. The question then becomes very similar to the question that's at the heart of All the President's Men, which I think is also 1974, by the way. So do you remember the famous scene where Jason Robards is playing the Washington Post publisher, editor, Ben Bradley, and Woodward and Bernstein, Hoffman and Redford bring the first version of their story in about Watergate. And if you recall, Bradley has his feet on the desk, which is very intimidating and purposely so. And then he tosses the early draft of the story down on the paper and says, where's the expletive deleted, which is a kind of double pun for this story. Where's the expletive deleted story? Where's the effing story? And I know people who know him, and I asked if this was true. And they said this was something that he commonly used or challenged his writers with. So on that basis, where's the story here? We have the archetypal image, which is, as our old friend Joe, as in Joe Campbell, once told me, you know it's a mythic image if it's inexhaustible. Isn't that a wonderful way to think about the difference between entertainment and an archetypal image that you can look at again and again and again? You don't say, I've heard that Cavafy poem, Ithaca, many times. I never need to hear it again. It's a masterpiece. We know because every time we hear it or read it, it reveals something new. Vermeer's Woman Writing a Letter, Beethoven's Ode to Joy. You only watch or hear those once? No. The greatest work, the truly mythic work, you look at again and again and again, which we have done for these last few thousand years. So let's delve into it. A few minutes of the slides, so you can see how the world has responded to this great myth, an evergreen story. And then we will, the whole last hour plus will be open to discussion. If, however, someone has a pressing question as I am looping through these images, raise your hand, come online, please break through, because this should be stimulating, because what I'm trying to explore here is that we have one of the most informing. This was another suggestion by Campbell when I was interviewing him about 1985 in Honolulu. Art, especially mythic art, is what in, and then he would say hyphen, in hyphen forms you. It helps form your psyche. The great work, the poetry, the music, the myth gets inside of your psyche, and almost in an alchemical way, gets into the bloodstream and helps form your idea of yourself in the world. And I want to make a case that this is what Sisyphus has done for us. So Dana, a few slides, please. So there we go. There's my Sisyphus bronze sculpture, which helped me keep going every day, every night, 18 to 20 hours a day till the book was finished. The secret passion of, and that's what I want to pursue. It's not just a secret, but it is a passion. Yes. So if you can see on the screen, here's my baby. All right, slide please, Dana. There's a wonderful image of Camus with a drawing or an engraving of the image of Sisyphus that I actually include in my book, now that I think about it, pushing the boulder uphill. And it's one of somewhere between 70 and 80 images of Sisyphus that we still have on amphora or vases. So there's a line again by Herbert, because of the pen of Albert Camus, Sisyphus becomes an allegory. And I want to suggest it's allegory for the artistic struggle, the political struggle, the struggle, as Jung suggested, of consciousness itself. Slide, please. One of my favorite books of mythology is Roberto Colasso, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony. One of the most poetic and in-depth references that I know of. And he has a kind of musical refrain that goes through the entire book, where he'll begin with this one line, always in italics. So, when did it all begin? Because as Campbell also believed, but also Mircea Eliade, Ellen Dundees from UC Berkeley, that is the great mythic question. How, when, why things begin. So there I am at the Ford Rotunda in Dearborn, 5 years old, reading a comic book upside down. Now, I'm sure that's metaphorical of something. I'm still trying to work that one out. And then next to it, is the first book on myth that I remember, which I still have, by the way, because we read books out loud together as a family growing up in Detroit. It's still a magnificent illustrated version of the Iliad and the Odyssey by Watson, with the great drawings by the Provenson couple. Slide, please. Eventually going to high school and then college, and then in my travels around the world, I began studying, reading always. I always had some book of myth in my back pocket or in my backpack. Homer, of course, gives us the first known line. Ovid's version of the Metamorphosis, 1500 years later, is quite beautiful. Here's Edith Hamilton, an incredible photo of her standing actually in front of the Parthenon when she was knighted, I believe it was, in Athens because of all her contributions to Greek scholarship. And that's a statue of Ovid, by the way, in the middle. In Constanta, Romania, where he was exiled. Slide, please. So here's the first known line that we have. Yes, Odysseus, this is on his Nicaea, down into the underworld. Of all the things that he saw, including his mother, Achilles, warriors, and so on, he sees Sisyphus. And the line is quite beautiful. In strong torment, grasping a ruthless stone with both his hands as he was about to hurl it over the top, but the weight would drive him back. Slide, please. And here I am, a younger bloke with Joe during the filming of the hero's journey out in Hawaii, as he would say, Hawaii. And over the course of a couple of weeks of filming, he said a few things, some that got into the film, some that got into my book, The Hero's Journey. Mostly he would say what his concern was that not whether myths were true or false, but whether or not they were alive. Because if they weren't alive, they were dead. And then I would ask him about his experience at teaching at Sarah Lawrence for 38 years. And I asked him why he was still so animated. And he always gave credit to his female students. He said, it wasn't just me. It wasn't Eliade, then he would name Robert Graves and all the other scholars. He said, it was my female students who challenged me to make it relevant to their lives. What does it mean? What does the myth mean to me today, to my life? And that is what's been driving me ever since. As I comment on myths for Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, recently for Pixar and Lucasfilms, but also I've been called in to discuss the mythological power for Major League Baseball. I've done 4 films on myth about baseball, but also NFL films. And the question is always to identify the profound myth, what I call the mythic push behind someone's life. Slide, please. But there are many types of Sisyphus. There is the noble Sisyphus, and then there is the punitive one, the one who betrayed the gods, who is portrayed again and again during medieval times. And this is the oldest known sculpture. It goes back significantly to around the 6th century. And if you can see that creature on his back, that's one of the Furies. And this is part of the story in most people's rendition, that anytime he had a moment of doubt, now think about this in our own personal myths, a moment of doubt, can I survive this? Can I keep going? Will I ever be released from hell? Zeus doubled up on the fact that he wanted to sentence him for all of eternity by having a Fury clawing at his back at that moment of doubt. Now, does that feel psychologically true? Our own moments of savaging doubt. Am I worth it? Am I a good scholar? Am I worth my salt as a psychotherapist? Whatever it might be, we have Furies on our back. Slide, please. And here's one of the images from the vases, which then 3 or 4 years ago, I hired an actual man who worked on modern amphoras with permission from the National Archaeological Museum to create versions that travelers, tourists can pick up today. So I commissioned him to create this one for me based on an old amphora drawing. And that became the cover of my book. Oh, sorry. So this one, there we go. And what's significant here is that we have Hermes on the right side, Hermes who guides him into the underworld. And then on the left side, this is very significant for our story, is the character of Persephone. And Persephone is one of the many female powers who actually allows Sisyphus to get home again. Now, this is an echo of the Odyssey. I led a tour just a few months ago in April. I'm leading another one next year, April 2023, in the footsteps of Odysseus and Penelope, because I am suggesting there are 6 female powers who actually help guide our hero back to Ithaca. So it's not just a male over-dominant testosterone-driven story. Ironically, depending on how you look at your history, it's the women who give him the wisdom to get home again. And wisdom is a word that I'll come back to in just a few minutes, but at the moment, because I'm the word guy, I love etymologies. Of course, I had to look up the etymology of our hero here, Sisyphus, which in ancient Greek actually means most wise. Can you see the word Sophia in there? So he's the wisest, and that sets up a dichotomy immediately, because there seemed to have been an older Sisyphus who was probably one of these punitive and possibly an evil king. He's credited with a number of incidents, and a couple of the early writers call him a highwayman, a scoundrel, but these are very vague notions. There is no proof he ever murdered anybody, and I've gone through over 87, all 87 attributions to Sisyphus in classical literature. I've tried to track all of them down. So something happened in the Middle Ages. I'll let you sort this out on your own, in which the story about telling the truth about God or the gods was no longer heroic. I have to emphasize that. It was no longer heroic. He was no longer a rebel hero. Instead, he was dastardly. Do you remember that great word? Because what? He did what he wasn't supposed to do. He told the secrets of the gods, the priests, the powers that be, which is the function, as you know, of newspaper reporting and I think all mythic reporting. Slide, please. So by the way, that was an image by Titian. He was commissioned to create 7 paintings to render all of the 7 deadly sins. Do you remember those that were drummed into you if you went to Catholic school? So that's from the ceiling of his palace in Austria, Vienna, Austria. And then now we have a modern Sisyphus who has been rescued from oblivion, so to speak, partly because of Camus, but also because of the New Yorker and others. So here is one version of Sisyphus at his laptop. Slide, please. Here's another common one. The image is used again and again in the world of sports, but also the world of acting, the world of the arts, of this effort. And this is a guy from the New York Mets, by the way, saying about how long it takes them to win a pennant. So you see, the story becomes identified with drudgery, repetition. Slide, please. Or work itself. Here's a funny one from the New Yorker. Hey, Sisyphus, when you get a moment, I'd like to discuss the progress report with you. There are dozens of these New Yorker versions of this the last few years. There were many during the pandemic itself. So you ask, why? It's because of our dread of doing the same thing again and again, being condemned for reasons that we don't deserve. Why did I get this job? Why did I get this office with no windows? This is what I call the Sisyphean mood. Slide, please. This is a powerful photograph that was taken, I believe, during the 1930s about the early women's movement. I haven't been able to find much more with that, but I love this. Again, it feels like a mythology gem. You don't even have to explain it, but the notion of getting women's rights, pulling or pushing the boulder to the top and then watching it roll down again brings us what? Into the modern mythic moment. We are right back there. Slide, please. Here he is again. Sisyphus, the boulder, the climb is one of the most popular tattoo motifs anywhere in the world. I had a book event a number of years ago for Once and Future Myths, my book of essays, which I got a book deal because people were saying, you now have to take the baton from Campbell, write your own book about myth. And so I'm signing dozens and dozens of books, and a young woman comes up to me and a little flirtatious, a little challenging. She's kind of winking. And then she gives me her very battered copy of Once and Future Myths. And she opens it to the title page. And she points out that there's a drawing there based on this, loosely based on this. And then I swear she gently pulled the hem of her skirt up and showed me that she had had a tattoo made on her thigh of this myth, because she said this story, the way you wrote about it in that was a book from 2001, helped make sense of the effort that I've had to make in my life. Slide, please. 1985, I'm working with Campbell, but I also became friends with the great humanist psychologist Rollo May. And I had a number of meetings with him over at his home in Tiburon, overlooking San Francisco Bay, in which he actually read out loud passages from what became his last book, The Cry for Myth. And in there, because we have been talking about Sisyphus and different takes on this, he wrote a passage in which he described how he believed that the myth of American progress was corrosive. It was destructive to the American soul, that you had to constantly do something new, make something better again and again and again. It was unrelenting. So he said the one, and he used the word antidote, by the way. The antidote to the myth of progress was the myth of Sisyphus, in which we accepted that the best things that we can accomplish, we have to master. Some people would now refer to the Malcolm Gladwell theory of the 10,000 hours that we have to infuse into any project, including the Beatles. How did they go from Hamburg to the biggest band in the world? So on and so on. The repetition. But then he also said that he felt that Sisyphus was a symbol of the forging of consciousness and the way that we make ourselves human. This, as we'll see, is very Jungian in the sense that we do not forge consciousness, we do not become aware unless we go down willingly into the underworld. What's that great line by Seleucus, the Roman writer? Those who don't go down willingly are yanked down into the underworld. I've always loved that Anglo-Saxon verb there. Slide, please. So I find there's a great drawing here of Sisyphus. On one hand, there's the Laocoon, the famous statue of the Laocoon, dug up in the Roman Forum, and a statue here of Saint Teresa of Avila. These are all rhapsodies on the theme, you might say, of the agonizing journey of the soul coming into consciousness. And I mean agonizing in the ancient Greek sense, which we will unpack here. Slide, please. A curious line I found by Jung. Here he is in Bollingen, where he's writing a letter to a friend. Surely Sisyphus was an idealist. In some translations, it's optimist, but idealist here. And something else that I found while I was actually writing the novel itself, this question of Jung. Remember, he has a midlife crisis and he's wondering, how can I get out of this? How can I get out of this? And he thought, what did I do as a child that made me feel whole again? And he decided to go back and do what made him happy as a young boy, which was doing what? Making sandcastles. So he took this insight literally a word I don't use very often, and that's the motivation for building Bowling Castle. And while he's actually making the castle, calibrating his own psychic makeup, you might say, he writes, "Am I the man sitting on the stone, or the stone looking at the man?" I think this cuts to the heart of the story of Sisyphus. Slide, please. The shadow side, in case those of you like Connie, for example, who are wondering about the shadow side of glorifying suffering, which I'm not trying to do. I'm trying to explicate it, tease it out. It's common. I worked for 5 years on a book about Jim Morrison and the Doors. So I was deeply rooted in this whole business of romanticizing the artistic agony, the poetic suffering. And it was Rollo, I brought this up with him, and he said that after doing psychotherapy for 55 years, he was convinced that people were coming to him not to be fixed as if they were going to a mechanic to fix their car, but instead they were going to hear someone who would listen to them, and then someone who would make some sense of their suffering, which I thought was a beautiful, beautiful sense. But we can literalize it, which is Amy Winehouse here, the whole so-called 27 Club. There are about 10 or 11 now rock and rollers who have all died at 27 years old, arguably because they literalized this whole Sisyphean struggle, the descent into the underworld, rather than try to look at it symbolically. Slide, please. And one way that I can understand this is the piece. This was a photo I took at an exhibit of the Aegon during the 2004 Olympics in Athens, because I had written a book on the history of the Olympics from a mythic point of view. And lo and behold, at the Archaeological Museum, they had an entire exhibit of this. So if you go into this word, which I'm coming back to that early reference to, this will help us understand my take on this and the whole mythopoetics of using this, rescuing this story to help us today, as Dana said, with the multiple sorrows that we have. The Aegon originally was a word for both contest. You are running a race, you're fighting like a gladiator, but it was also the general word for struggle. And then the agonist, with ISTE, was the one who competed in athletics, but it was the same word for actor. If you were acting in a Euripides play, you were considered an athlete of sorts. And if you were running in the pentathlon in Olympia, you were considered an actor on the great stage. All this is folded into our story of Sisyphus. He is working out on a symbolic level what it means to agonize. Slide, please. So to back this up, here I am at the Temple of Apollo, leading one of my literary tours, again, leading another one next April. We're at Delphi, and this is my son, Jack, just a few years back. I took him and, what was it, 22 16-year-olds around Greece and told them stories with 440 volts, not the half-baked version, but the full-bore story. And when we got to Delphi, I said, everybody will have some time to go up to the ramp, which leads into the Adyton, into the sanctuary of the oracle, and you can ask your own question. What we know, it's so common now, Nothisoton, know thyself, was the most famous of the aphorisms, and it was the one that would have been on the lintel as you were entering the actual temple. But fewer people know that once you entered, there were 76 other aphorisms from the 7 sages of Greece painted. So it's kind of amazing. You were taking your question in to see the oracle while you were surrounded by what would have been considered the collective wisdom of Greece. And one of the aphorisms was struggle for life. That word is at the heart of the Greek miracle. It's at the heart of the Greek genius. It's not just all this brilliance came to us. And it was effortless. We put up these glorious temples and we wrote these glorious plays. No, the Greek notion was that life was a struggle. And do you have the wit, the wherewithal, the endurance to turn that struggle, to transform it into something else? Arguably, I'm making a case in my book for wisdom itself. Slide, please. So what can the story teach us today? As a little summing up just for this part one, it's how to struggle wisely, not just to hurt, not to act in self-pity, not to over-dramatize, melodramatize our lives, but to learn how to struggle smart, how to be more clever, maybe than the next guy, the next woman, in order to do what? To come back, and as many of you know, Joe Campbell's probably a line that should have gone into The Hero with a Thousand Faces, but didn't until The Myths to Live By. When he finishes his essay on the journey in that little book, he would say, Phil, it was just this little book. That's how he would explain it to me. The real purpose of the journey was to come home again and contribute something to the people who are back at home, to contribute something to the community, not for self-aggrandizement. That was the phrase he always used. So I want to argue that that's what this story tells us. Slide, please. So in 10 minutes, we'll roar through this. The story begins significantly, not accidentally, not academically, with Prometheus and the theft of fire. One of the marvels of research, as you all well know and are probably proud of, is the surprise. Marc Chagall once said, all art is in the surprise. It's finding something you did not anticipate when you set out. So what I discover here is that Prometheus is the great-great-great-grandfather of Sisyphus. And this is significant because his name, remember that so much of this is wound up in our words, means forethought. Like his brother was afterthought. Prometheus means, this means he had a gift of prophecy. He knew what was going to happen if Zeus discovered he stole fire to help create modern thinking human beings and really forge civilization itself. Likewise, we do have tracks, passages in which the classical writers wrote about Sisyphus as having the gift of prophecy. Isn't this interesting? So when he makes the decision we're just about to come to, he knows damn well, and I do mean damn well, what is about to happen. Slide, please. So he's born in the north to a king and a queen through a long series of events, which I recount in the book, but it's too much to go into now. He is exiled rather than named king when his father dies. And he wanders, and this is in the tradition, quite a beautiful one, of the wandering hero, or sometimes people call it the wandering scholar. This is at the heart of the Greek genius, that the scientists, the poets, the playwrights, the warriors, they were all travelers. I think this is literally true in some ways, but it's also symbolically true. As brilliant as Athens might have been, it still wasn't enough. So we get the fruit of their labors because they traveled so far. And I go in and I tease this out in my novel, and I have him arriving in Corinth, just as, of all people, Jason and Medea, who had been there as king and queen for a very short time, it's just as they are leaving. And we have evidence of this in the plays, whereas Medea gets on a ship to leave, she tosses the keys of the city to Sisyphus, who's just arriving on horseback with his mentor, is, oh, so I guess I can be king here. I wasn't king at home, so I'm king here. Slide, please. So there we go. The great mythologism of learning and exploring. This is an old 18th century lithograph of the ruins of Corinth. Very important to note, as I'm making my case here, that at the height of Corinth's history, and this is always aligned with the rule of Sisyphus himself, it was considered a richer, more brilliant, more innovative city than Athens. This is enormously important to his story. Slide, please. Once he arrives, he's a young buck, probably 18, 19 years old. And according to some hints in the old texts, which I found, and then I tease out, Merope is a beautiful princess from Crete. So she has come over with the wisdom of the goddess culture, with the wisdom of the Minoan people, but also the wisdom knowing that she is one of the 7 daughters of Atlas. She's one of the Pleiades. So she was immortalized. They get married. They have 4 sons and a very famous grandson, Bellerophon. Slide, please. So one of the great, for me, was a tremendous breakthrough, and I hope some of you can feel the exhilaration of this. It's one thing to tell an old story. It's another thing to go into every known variation on those old stories, and then to see something that hasn't been accounted for before. That's what drives me as a writer and scholar. It's a thrilling moment, isn't it? Thrilling being an old word, by the way, that used to mean what happens when an arrow hits the target. Isn't that incredible? That zzz, when the arrow hits, that's the origin of our word thrill. And that's how I feel when I make some of these breakthroughs. It's visceral, not just psychological, or no, I shouldn't say just, it's visceral. So my version here is that now what unfolds is the missing complement to Prometheus and the myth of fire. If you've studied ancient Greece for a while, and it looks like all of you have, then you know there's always this notion of Greek harmony, the Greek balance. You never have one thing without the other. Jung would have called it enantiodromia, where one thing goes too far in one direction and it goes off into the other side, almost like a seesaw, the kind we rode when we were kids. So the fact that the Greeks have only this story of the myth of fire never made sense to me in my understanding of Greek balance. Now it does. Because I submit to you that Sisyphus was to water what Prometheus was to fire. Slide, please. So 3 images just to dwell on for a moment here. Take that in, because it's at the heart of our talk, and this is what I really want to discuss with all of you. These are incredible images of Ananke, who's the goddess of necessity. Much of the story is driven by Ananke. There is something where Paris needs to meet Helen in the Judgment of Paris. Odysseus needs to be humbled and humiliated over and over again, and he needs to earn the trust and love of Penelope when he gets back to Ithaca. He has been involved in so much carnage and rampage in Troy and then on the way home that he needs to be purified again, and he cannot do this alone. So the great storytellers, the rhapsodes of ancient Greece, have him confront the goddess of necessity in the underworld. This is her on the right, the photo I took actually in Corinth at the museum there. And then Kairos. This is the only known sculpture of Kairos in the world. And it was found on the bottom of a tomb in a nunnery in Yugoslavia. But there he is, holding the scales of fate, wings on his back, wings on his feet, tipping the scales. If you seize fate, if you seize the moment, which is the origin, by the way, of seize the day by the Romans. The original phrase was seize the moment. The day is too late. So slide, please. slide again, that's modern Corinth. From that mountaintop, let's go back to that one, Dana, if you can. So here it is, in a nutshell, which again is an old Greek phrase, by the way. Back to Plutarch, that Alexander the Great used to carry an edition of the Iliad with him when he went off to war that was able to fit inside of a walnut. Hence our phrase, in a nutshell. So our story goes that here he is on the citadel at the very top of the mountain here in Corinth, minding his own business, maybe looking out at the beautiful pasture lands. They were famous for their horses. And he sees something that he shouldn't see. If you know the history of drama, this is where all good stories begin. Right in the heat of the moment, not too much backstory. It begins here. Excuse me. So our story is, he sees, slide please. He sees a giant eagle, which, if you know mythically, is the animal, the bird, the totem of Zeus. It was the form he usually took when he was, frankly, horny, when he was alone, when he wanted to seduce. The scholars that I read, like say Michael Finley, for example, says that there are 100 instances of Zeus seducing either in a nymph, a goddess, or a mortal woman. 100. This is the only known case where there's pushback, or the major one anyway. So he sees this eagle spiraling in the beautiful winds above, and then the eagle descends, claws extended, when he sees this beautiful river nymph named Aegina, A-E-G-I-N-A. Grabs the young river nymph by the claws and then dashes off to an island that is now named after her, Aegina. The island of Aegina was Zeus's lair. This is where he took the young women that he, and then the verb, you play with this as you like. Sometimes the old Greek writers would use the word rape, sometimes abduct, sometimes capture, but it's always about taking a woman against her will. That's what's common here. The response is what's uncommon. Slide, please. Here's Aegina, the river nymph, and her father, Asopus. So he sees this and fear comes into him. This is the, sometimes they call it the Spike Lee moment. Do you remember that movie, Do the Right Thing? It's at the heart of all drama. It's at the heart of all dramatic life. You see what's sometimes called the Hobson's choice, where there is no one perfect solution. Both responses are thorny. Both responses will bring trouble. That's at the heart of drama. That's what makes deep drama so damn difficult. There is no perfect answer. We human beings have to pay a price when they come up to one of these mythic moments. So in this one, the river god Asopus hears the wailing, the cries of his daughter, and immediately he swings around. There are beautiful accounts of this in Aeschylus and later in Ovid, in which he's roaring, "What happened to my daughter? What happened?" And he calls upon, I've always loved this, the goddess Rumor. You know, Rumor was actually a goddess. Originally Ossa, O-S-S-A, but the Romans then called her Rumor. She's the one who was flying again with wings from incident to incident. So she always knows what's going on. Asopus says, "Do you know someone who might know where my daughter is?" And she says, "King Sisyphus." So Asopus roars up to the citadel and gives Sisyphus the great dramatic question, which determines that story, and I think is at the heart of most of our lives, even to this day. It's the Hobson's choice. He says, "Sisyphus, either you tell me truly who took my daughter, what happened to him, or I will cut off the water supply to Corinth." If any of you have been to the Mediterranean, if any of you have traveled in Greece, especially, you know how mythically, archetypally important water is. All cities were built around wells or cisterns. You couldn't survive without this. So what does Sisyphus hear in his third ear, you might say? Okay, if I tell him that Zeus took his daughter, Zeus will, and I know this for a fact, will exact his revenge. But if I don't tell the truth, he will cut off the water and all my people will die, including my wife, including my 4 boys, including all the citizens of Corinth, which is guesstimated around 30,000 people would have been living in Corinth around that time. So there have been a couple other commentators, including a Jungian therapist who wrote this book, 1986, Verena Cast, wonderful book about this as a metaphor for the midlife crisis. But in there, she said something curious, that the one thing the story lacks is love. Well, it's not true. If you look deeply into the story, it's all about love. King Sisyphus sacrifices himself so that his people will live, so that his people will have not just fire, but also water. Slide, please. One of the only known paintings of Asopus. And here's a wonderful river in the west. So you can get this sense that rushing waters, the streams of water, water means life, period, in Greek myth, but also in Greek life. Slide, please. So this is the spring that's referred to, and it's there to this day. My wife Jo and I walked up to the summit of the Corinth just a few years ago, and we got within hailing distance of this spring, which is remarkable because this is 3,000 feet or so above sea level. And somehow the river, and it's actually called the Asopus to this day, named after the god, somehow makes its way uphill into the citadel. And there's a magnificent temple that's built around the Pyrene spring to show you the sanctity of water, but also the sanctity of this story of Sisyphus and why he was and is revered to this day, versus the transmogrification that he was a murderer, that he committed the worst sacrilege of all, he betrayed Zeus. No, he sacrificed himself for people, his own people. Slide, please. So this is the moment of deliberation for me. And this is the moment I try to tease out when I'm teaching creative writing, and I use the Sisyphus myth, when I'm leading the tours, and every day we have what I call the long conversation, which is an echo of all my conversations with Joe Campbell. That's what we actually called it when we met many times a year. Joe, do you want to have a long conversation? Or then he would call me and I would hear that golden question, Phil, I'm back in San Francisco. Do you want to have one of our long conversations? So this is what I like to call this, and I love this. It's a mosaic, actually, of him. It's a moment of contemplation. He's leaning against the boulder, probably just the moment before it rolls back downhill. This is the moment. This is what Albert Camus calls the hour of consciousness. Isn't that glorious? That there's a moment at the height of our agony, our suffering, our deliberation. Did I do the right thing? Did I do the right thing? And Camus spotted it, and he called it the hour of consciousness. Slide, please. So the way that I deal with this in my book is I have this as an echo of his love for her. When Sisyphus is finally condemned, he's in the underworld, and the 3 judges like Minos ask, why did you do this? You could have gotten out scot-free. I did it for love. I did it for my wife. I did it for my city. This has even been performed recently by a dance company. Slide, please. What fascinates me, and I hope we can explore this, I just have another 10 slides or so here, is that this moment has then been deliberated probably since the mid 6th century in Greece, all the way through the Middle Ages, all the way up into modern times. And that is our attitude towards authority? Do you just agree with what your boss says, what the Vatican says, what political commentators are saying, or what your parents are saying? Or do you believe there's a deeper calling? The Greeks believed it was actually personified as a woman, a goddess named Ananke, that there is a power, a kind of a surge in every moral dilemma, which has an echo of necessity. Jung writes about this constantly, those who do not go down into the underworld are avoiding death. They are consciously avoiding suffering and growth. He writes this, and I can give a citation if you need that later on, but he says, if you do this, if you avoid that descent into the underworld that Sisyphus took, that Odysseus took, you are avoiding suffering at your own peril because you will never grow. This story is about the psychodynamics of actual growth. We'll see what he says here. Unless you make the unconscious conscious, unless you go down into your suffering, unless you go down into your wound, that suffering will direct your life. Slide, please. Rather than the other way around. So in this case, what there are 3 or 4 different versions of this. I tried to meld them together in my novel. One is that Hermes is summoned to come and seize Sisyphus from the citadel, from the castle. And that's the first version that I use in the book because it's so dramatic. Hades appears, and just the vision of him is so significant because the Greeks said he used to cry black tears when he would arrive and call someone down into the underworld. But then the sight of him, there's a whole sub-story here where Sisyphus actually puts him into chains, so there's no death for a while. Everybody is upset. The god of war, Ares, is upset. Eventually, Hermes takes him down into the underworld, which is why he's called Psychopompus. He is the one who guides you to the river Styx, guides you across the river and down. Slide, please. This is called knowing your darkness. It's the best method of dealing with the darkness of others. Slide, please. All these thousands of paintings of this. There's another version, which I try to include a bit in my own poetic version of this, where some of the commentators say it was Thanatos, not Hades. That's a softer way of looking at death, the call to death, the punishment. And as you see in this very interesting piece that I took from the Louvre, Thanatos is always depicted as dreamy, a kind of liminal character, so not terrifying. Remember, Hades was so feared, there was a kind of, you were not supposed to even utter his name in common conversation. So this was a softer way of thinking about death. And his brother was Hypnos. Slide, please. So there's a wonderful painting of Hermes who takes him down into the underworld. Slide, please. They reach the river Styx, where Charon is waiting for them. And Charon guides them to the other side of the river Styx. Slide, please. And again, thousands of images of this. And I'm serious, thousands of these. It's one of the most colorful images because it personifies our fear of the underworld. And there is a theory, Michael Finley and some others describe this, that these images of Sisyphus's descent into the underworld eventually inspired our notion of hell. The imagery, the iconography, the power, the terror. Slide, please. The fact that it's underground. And then I'll try to go through these as quickly as possible so that we have some time for discussion. He faces 3 judges who say, you defied, you betrayed the gods. There's Minos, Rhadamanthus, Iacchus, and you are now condemned to push this boulder up a mountain for the rest of eternity. Slide, please. So there he is. This is part of the iconography. There are maps. There are very colorful paintings to describe what it's like to be underground. Hot heat and inescapability. Slide, please. But when he's there pushing on the boulder, he's introduced to the boulder. Minos actually says, if you tip it over the other side, and you know he's winking kind of at the other judges, then we'll let you go. But Sisyphus doesn't believe that. So he has to think quickly. And now this is part of the psychology. Remember, he's the wisest of the gods. So he's not a doofus. He's not just intent on being a highwayman. Instead, he realizes when he meets the Hades, who's very cold, of course, to him, that Persephone happens to be there, and that Persephone knows what it means to be unjustly thrust into the underworld, and what it must mean to her mother, Demeter, to miss her for, and then depending on the myth, it's either 4, 6, 8 months a year. There are variations of this. So she identifies, she's psychological, which means she knows about the conditions of the powers of the soul. In most versions of the story, including the 3 great playwrights, by the way, who emphasize this, that he approaches Persephone, or he waits for Persephone to come and visit him while he's pushing the boulder up the mountain. And he says to her something very key. He said, you know what it must mean to miss a loved one. You miss your mother, right? You miss your husband Hades, nod, nod, wink, wink, when you have to go back up to Eleusis, back to the overworld. So imagine my wife, Merope. I was seized from her. She had no time to give me a funeral, no time for a transition of power. Persephone, do you think you could give me 2 or 3 days up there in Corinth just to settle my affairs? I promise I'll be right back. This is in all the dramas. Okay. Slide, please. And then what then happens is she gives him, she has to convince Hades, let him go. You know, they are, how can you say, this is a sacrilege. They did not honor your funeral rites, Hades. You are the god of death. You were not honored. So let Sisyphus go back, arrange for the funeral, the transition of power, all of this business, and he will be back. I talked this over with the man in this photo. This is me in Glastonbury, England, just about 3-4 years ago, leading a King Arthur tour in pursuit of the Holy Grail. And we're in the, you can actually see those are the arches of Glastonbury Abbey right behind us. And underneath, there's a plaque underneath those arches. Here lies Guinevere and King Arthur. So this is a mythic photo now that I think about it. So I'm talking about King Arthur, of course, and then I bring up Sisyphus. And what Jeffrey brought out so brilliantly, I have been thinking about, but hadn't quite written yet. And that is his interest in, and Albert Camus, is what happens in the moment when our king is going back downhill in pursuit of the boulder. He cannot keep up with the boulder. It's sheer physics. A boulder will always roll faster than the rest of us. So Jeffrey, and I've been playing with this for a while, you realize, oh, why should I even run after this thing? I'm going to take a few moments here. And these are the moments when the idea of escape came to Sisyphus, when he had a few moments to consider, to think about his future. Or, and this is a moment for all of us, what could I do if I get a reprieve? I just survived heart surgery. I just narrowly missed dying in a car accident, or today in the floods in Florida. If I get more time, what would I do with it? This is the moment I try to expand on and dilate in my story. Slide, please. So I make the case here, and these are the last 3 or 4 slides here, that when he gets back, he's still a young man. He would have been mid-20s. How and why would I say this rather than old age? It's the paintings, the murals. There were at least 80. We have found 80, which meant there were probably 800 or 8,000 images of Sisyphus on vases, amphoras, murals. One entire wall in the Temple of Apollo at Delphi. You would have passed it when you went to give your question to the oracle, was of Sisyphus in the underworld. His image was omnipresent because I think he was beginning to question the relationship between human beings and the gods, between fate and destiny. So that when he returns, this is now, there is actually some historical reference. So we're in the realm of legend as well as myth. He's credited with founding the equivalent of the Olympic Games. They're called the Isthmian after the isthmus there. He's credited with innovating navigation, building brand new ships, a whole new form of banking, etc., creating temples to Aphrodite, Hera, Hecate. All this is to say, the Greeks filled in later on with their poets, with their paintings, with their sculptures, to say when he was released and returned from the underworld, he was a changed man. He was transformed by his encounter with death, by taking it on, by accepting that he would have had to pay a price. Slide, please. And then in the famous last line here, famous last two lines, this is the modern Corinth, a photo I took just a few years ago. You can see it takes an effort to get up to there. Camus writes on the last page of his essay, when Sisyphus returned again and felt the face of the world, he enjoyed the water and the sun, the warm stones in the sea. He no longer wanted to go back to the infernal darkness. Hey, can you blame the guy? He loved being back with people. He felt like he had had a reprieve. He was given a second chance. This is also at the heart of the entire story of the Odyssey, which, if you take the time to read the book, I follow another tradition that is startling to hear, but I take it on the advice of Aeschylus, Euripides, Sophocles, and many other poets later on, that Sisyphus was the real authentic father of Odysseus. Laertes, in the later versions of the myth of the Odyssey, is left out of the story. And my thinking, real brief here, is that because Laertes is a beautiful old man, he's kind, he's a farmer, he has all these wonderful attributes. But somewhere in the Greek mind, during the classical age of poetry and playwriting, they didn't believe that someone so kind of a soft male, as our old buddy Robert Bly would have called him, could have possibly fathered Odysseus. So there's another whole story where Sisyphus seduces Odysseus's mother, and out comes Odysseus, so that there's an encounter in the underworld, and then there's a longer encounter on the mountain that I have in my book. Then the last slide, please. Which brings us to the famous last line. And then I'm very eager to open this up for questions as long as you want. And I love this sepia tone image, that this is the heart, this is what I have to believe myself in being creative in every possible field I can be. This is what I try to inculcate into all of my students, what I've tried to teach my son in his young life. The struggle itself towards the height can be, not isn't always, but it can be enough to fill someone's heart. We must, il faut imaginer is Camus' actual French. We must imagine, not just think. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. Why? Because he chose his own fate and turned that into destiny, which is very different from having our fate slapped down on us by circumstances, by chemistry, by biology, by social conditions. We have to imagine Sisyphus happy. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Well, I'm like, this myth is so important to me, and I know the other version of it. So I am still trying, I'm like in cognitive dissonance world, trying to like get off of the things that I think about the myth in the way that I know it, and to engage it in the way that you've described. I think that's probably a challenge for all of us.
Well, I'm sorry you were saddled with that old version of the myth, but I'm telling you, the classical Greeks completely turned the whole story around. It's in all of their plays about him. We do know that there are two missing plays by Aeschylus: Sisyphus the stone roller and Sisyphus the runaway.
Huh.
And there's another the play that we have one fragment of by Critias, who was one of Plato's students. If you remember, there's a whole dialogue with Critias, who wrote an entire play also about this. And we have uncannily this one passage where he essentially says, human beings, we invented the gods because we are afraid. We are in fear. And all these retakes, all the mythopoetics that took place then, nevertheless, during the 19th century and then the 20th century with writers like Virginia Woolf, writers like Albert Camus, come about looking at the struggle not as incidental and certainly not as a punishment. It's also there. If you look at the artwork, Will, if you look at the artwork, you do not see someone, other than the later artwork, which is a little tortured. You probably picked up on some of those, but all the paintings, all the sculptures, all the frescoes that come about from this period in Greece are all of him smiling. He is accepting his fate. He's not wincing. He has accepted the fact that it takes 10,000 hours to get this boulder up the mountain.
And then the imagery you shared, there's another image that I just was stunned by, because actually I've continued this story in my own dreams and in my own experiences that have been pretty intense. And it turns out my experiences of the stories continuing are actually much closer to the myth that you're describing, which I'm still like, geez. And one of the things that was so stunning was what you said about two things really specifically. One is you showed the image of the spring bursting out of the mountain. And for me, I used to be trapped in this idea of the mountain as truth, you know, this idea that, well, isn't there one truth? And it was a prison of consciousness. Ooh. And then in my mind, something happened and that mountain started to look more like this. You guys know this image.
I actually used that in other versions. The lecture I gave for Jung on the Hudson a couple months ago, I used that because I cite Jung so often. There's a Sisyphean part of Jung, believe me, where he's always talking about the utter necessity and the perils of avoiding this journey into the underworld. The perils of looking at this is in terms of victimhood. That is what the medieval transmogrification was all about. This is what's going to happen if you disobey the gods. Look what's going to happen. Whereas Jung, and even James Joyce in his version of Ulysses, he quotes some of these scenes. He's talking the Nighttown episode. So the utter necessity of going down into this darkness in order to feel the nourishment that's there. And so I'm making the case actually in the book that something happened to him in order to go from just one more king, one more leader, into someone who transforms a very small town on the isthmus in the Peloponnese into a city that not only rivaled but surpassed Athens. So as a storyteller, I'm wondering, how did this happen? These things don't happen overnight. I mean, look at what goes into forging Michelangelo's consciousness, Da Vinci's consciousness, Virginia Woolf later on. It is always a dark descent and then coming out anew.
And that was the other image that really stuck. And I promise I'll get off my own personal mythology after this, which is at the top of the mountain where you see the thing blowing off. And when you get the idea that Sisyphus Mountain actually has a spring coming through it, completely transforms the image. Completely transforms the image. And now you go from this idea of truth as this with something. Now you have this idea of a flow, and you have an idea of water as the truth coming out. It's a completely different relationship with what's going on. And for me at the top where it's all coming out, I eventually had a dream where Prometheus, because Prometheus is my other guy, Prometheus and Sisyphus were together. And there at the top of the mountain, over the hole in the top of the mountain was suspended a man. And in the man was a hole in his stomach. And that hole was the same shape as the shape that was, again, repeating. The wound was a repeating wound. And then there's a little can sitting on top of the wound, like a sardine can, just ajar, just enough to keep it from falling through. The dream begins with me fixing it and then watching the can fall through the wound. The descent through the wound, which you were talking about, the value of descending into and through the wound and into and through the repetition. And I don't have any analysis yet. I just am so stunned and so appreciative of what you've given me with this completely transformed understanding of the myth. So thank you.
All right. Thank you. Just a quick aside on that. I was lecturing years ago with Robert Johnson, the famous psychologist, he, she, and we, and so on. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about the wound, the central importance of the wound in the King Arthur legends. And then he did something that I know I do constantly too. Phil, do you know the origin of the word bless? So I'm always going into word origins, right? I've written books about this. And he said it goes back to the old French blessure, which means wound. So your blessing is always in your wound.
That's so interesting because my relationship with that thought comes from Dennis, who I remember one day he wasn't there for the opening of our year, and he sent some line to us to be read to us all. And what was it, Dennis? May your blisters be your bliss.
Yes.
Oh, we're muted still, Dennis.
Exactly right. And just to reinforce what Phil just said, pay really close attention to where the world wounds us.
Ooh.
Because it's blessing us in some oblique way that maybe a greater consciousness is needed to make the connection. Yeah.
Thank you for that. That's the hour of consciousness. It might be recognizing the primacy of your wound, rather than devolving again and again into the victim language. No, this wound, this is what has forged me, not just made me, but forged me. So somebody else want to jump in here?
And we can't forget the scar on Odysseus's thigh,
sure,
which identifies it. I mean, is it his identity, his origin is there in the scar, which is the memory of the wound.
And the etymology of Ulysses is thigh wound.
Thigh wound. That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thigh wound.
Yeah. James Hillman shared that one with me. We used to play a word origins like ping pong. So somebody else want to jump in, please?
Yeah, please.
I'll jump in. I'll just say from kind of a philosophical perspective, trying to track in some ways it seems like alliances drawing from Camus, and other ways it seems like sort of a rejection of certain aspects of Camus' reading, which has been interesting. I read just a little bit of your book so far, and I'll read more. So I tracked some of that there, tracked some of that here. And I think one of I don't know if you've considered this, but one thing when I was reading your book a little bit and hearing it here is I feel like you're a little more on par with kind of a Kierkegaardian, like a more existentialist character. There's a little more in your reading of this, like, teleological suspension of the ethical, of somebody defying the gods or God for the greater good. That's kind of like defying the standard morality for something that is unseen, like will never be recognized though. So as I was trying to enter you, I felt like you were going there with Sisyphus, this higher good, this, rejection of the gods, but something he's got to do. And so he lives, with that truth. But the one thing that I'm curious if you have anything to say about it, that's kind of irks me with it is this piece that's like glory, right? There's like with the Kierkegaardian hero, there's no glory. That's really the thing, the teleological suspension of the ethical. You are probably going to die in shame. If whether it's just, you deal with it, you take that on yourself. And so when that's so typical when you see that character, like kind of the, Abraham, that just, you don't, I'm not a great biblical scholar, but you don't, it's just something you've really got to do and you won't ever be understood for it. So, but Sisyphus, there's so much glory to be had. And, you know, that's what I wrestle with. So I guess I'm pushing back a little bit, but in terms of, is he moving from love to save the city? Or is that in some ways the most glorious thing a king could do in ancient Greece? I mean, certainly there was such an emphasis, if you consider, you know, Pericles' funeral oration and the way that the Athenians were moved was by leaving your mark. The more you could leave your mark, the more you could do something great in your name was the greatest glory. So I'm wrestling with this idea of, is he this sort of hero that really defied the gods and did it in this just knowing like, I've got to do what I've got to do and it'll go down how it goes down? Or was he just doing the most glorious thing and kind of, you know, from a feminine perspective too, kind of tricking women left and right a little bit, because he does kind of trick Persephone. And he appeals to her, but he's tricking her. I mean, he doesn't make good on his deal. And his wife, you know, the version I've always known is he says, don't throw me, don't give me a proper burial, because that way I'll get to come back. There's this, I'm wrestling with how moral, how ethical it really is. And I think that either interpretation fit with Camus. I don't think Camus sees him as highly ethical. I think he just sees him as a condition that we deal with, which could go either way.
Thank you. That's a brilliant response. I don't see the two as antithetical. This is at the heart of the mystery of the great heroes rather than the one-dimensional heroes. What is Odysseus? How has he been described for 3,000 years? Heroic, but also a bit of a knave, a bit of a trickster, often called a liar. And then you'd have to go into what a liar means throughout human history to understand that. But I think what the Greeks are saying is you had to be clever. You had to know the tricks to win a war, to win a race, to win political ascendancy. Pericles was a trickster. They're all tricksters. So there's a good side and a bad side. Remember this whole other lineage then, that he gets that knavery, the trickster aspect from his father, who was Sisyphus, not just in a minor version of it, but I'm telling you, in the major ones, all the three major playwrights did not believe Laertes could possibly have sired this great, clever hero, but also vain. So there is an element of vanity in all of these heroes. Then to circle back to the first thing, of course, glory would have had to be a part of it. The Greek word would have been kleos, K-L-E-O-S. And we know it's a thirst. That's the word they often use. It's a thirst for glory, a thirst for recognition, a thirst for acknowledgement, a desire to be immortalized in your actions on the battlefield, in your actions at Olympia, in your actions even as a writer, for all you writers out there. But there's another layer of that, which I've always loved. Underneath that notion of kleos is a desire to leave a story behind, which I just find glorious. No pun intended. Isn't that something? I want to do what is right in the Spike Lee version of it, or in the Shakespearean version. I want to do what's right. I want to do something that's moral and ethical, but the world at heart is shadowy. The world at heart is evil. Remember, Camus is writing this at a moment in history when everybody was suspicious of everybody else in Paris. Who is actually collaborating with the Nazis here? Who has the best intentions for us? For the French ourselves. So he's writing this and he is picking one of the most mercurial characters in Greek mythology. Of course, he's not completely noble. The Greeks never created a memorable character like that. I'm not saying he didn't seduce, that he didn't perform his tricks, but he did what he had to survive, is what I'm saying. And I think Camus comes down on the side of that as well. He humanizes him because he gives us an image that says when this cat comes back from the underworld, where it's been dark, it's been cold, it's been suspicious, I was threatened with absolute eternity. That was the original sentence. You will push this boulder and then chase it again for the rest of eternity. That was the sentence handed down from Zeus to the three judges. So he's wrestling with all that. It's a cold, heartless, soulless place. When he comes back into the world of warmth, the world of family, something transforms in him. And that's what I'm interested in here. The utter transformation into someone who was a bit of a Renaissance figure, involved with philosophy, the arts. He built stadiums, he built temples, he built sports facilities, all of the above. So how do you account for that? Psychologically, but if you're a storyteller, you're writing a play, you're writing a poem, you're writing a novel like this, you have to account for that change somehow. Because the man who comes back and turns Corinth into the greatest city in the world, including surpassing Athens, is not the one who was yanked down into the underworld. So I hope that gives you.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's interesting.
Thank you.
I'm thinking about that connection to Prometheus you made, and this kind of whole conversation of, is he a good guy or not, and what is defining a good guy at the time. And clearly between Odysseus, Prometheus, and Sisyphus, they're all challenging the gods. And there's a particular scene that I think about, and that is at Macon, after the flood, when Prometheus has, the humans have barely survived the flood. They've limped onto the place to have the feast with the gods, and they only have barely enough, one bull, I think it is. And Zeus says, okay, well, now I will take my sacrifice. And now Prometheus has to decide, am I going to piss off Zeus, or am I going to take care of humans? And that's the exact same choice that you described Sisyphus making. Really interesting.
Thank you for that. I read the poet Robert Lowell's translation of Prometheus while I was writing the book, because I had loved a biography about him. Turning the river into fire, I think was the title of the biography, kind of a psychobiography, because it goes deeply into the usually unknown fact that he fought madness his entire life. He had 27 electroshock therapy sessions to try to jolt him, in every sense of that word, jolt him back into sanity. And he told his wife at the time, Elizabeth Hardwick, that I hate to tell you this, sweetheart, but I'm at my most clear right in those hours after the electroshock therapy. And that's where I write my greatest poetry. That must have been horrifying for her to hear that. Not when you're in love with me at home, but your clarity, you're telling me your best poetry is when you are incarcerated in these madhouses. So in the last, I read his version of Prometheus, which is absolutely brilliant. And then his last collection called Life Studies. And on the very last page of Lowell's book, which won again the Pulitzer, he writes, I am hell. Not I'm in hell. I am hell. I think he's writing that to his wife. I think he's just, you've got to understand, I'm not just here, I'm not just visiting, I'm not play acting. I am hell. And somehow that influenced what I was writing here, that there must have been a part of that in our king. We're talking about him as if he's real, which is part of the brilliance of art, right? The classical Greeks, the poets, the painters, the sculptors, they all believed he was real on the level of how we would talk about Hamlet, Othello, the great characters of our drama. We don't talk about them. Well, Shakespeare's Hamlet, we talk about Hamlet as if he exists now in our presence. That's utterly dazzling to me, that someone would be so reified. What is underneath that? And Will, I'm submitting this to you, that the nasty side of this story was probably the older versions about how he was just one more of the betrayers and he has to be sacrificed forever into the underworld. That by the time those stories came down into classical Greece, the Greek philosophers were changing their attitude towards divinity, towards what's numinous or not. They could not write about Sisyphus or Odysseus, by the way, because they changed his parentage. They could not write about these characters in the same way. They had to write them, as I think is part of a lot of our philosopher rebel heroes, as skeptics, doubters, the ones who are cleverly questioning the status quo. And that is why you see the images of him in all these vases, but also in the sculptures with a crack of a smile on his face. I'm defying you, I'm defying the times, but I'm also personifying the times.
Yeah.
The character that you bring up, the goddess of necessity, seems to have this necessary link between the descent and transformation. And so when you think about them having a taste of transformation, it's a rejection of the status quo and essentially a hope that something better awaits them. And it's that necessity that brings it out and doesn't let them easily get rid of the idea of transformation. They're addicted to it.
Thank you for that. Roberto Colasso, who I mentioned earlier, one of my favorite writers on myth, in The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony, he describes the ancient Greek attitude towards Ananke as being so powerful that Ananke and Eros were the only two gods that Zeus actually fears. Because he can't control love. He can control everything else, but he can't control Eros or Aphrodite, kind of / Aphrodite, but he also had no power over Ananke, over necessity. She was more powerful than him, more powerful than the old order.
And according to certain philosophical historians, that beginning of recognizing an order beyond the personalized gods, that was paving the ground for the birth of philosophy, for logos.
Nice. So just one last note on that, because I see we're edging up towards our own limitations, our own liminal space here. And that is, I rescue a character from anonymity, you might say, because as I'm writing an actual novel, which is a dramatization of these ideas, otherwise they just remain theories, I had to look for a character who was plausible but not necessarily vastly recognized. So I look around and I did Persephone and Hades have any children? That's just where my mind went. Because I need a force on the mountain who will help him get off the mountain, besides Persephone. Persephone gives him permission, but then there's another power that has to be called upon. And I found a goddess who's mentioned once in the old sources. The Suda, S-U-D-A. It's a volume. There's only one copy of it in the Alexandria Museum in Egypt. It was kind of the Encyclopedia Britannica for the ancients. It was this vast source book of thousands of pages in which every character, every plot was filed away. It's called the Suda. So I look her up in there. It's Macaraya, the daughter of Hades and Persephone, and she's the goddess of the blessed death. Again, this is very Greek in thinking, in psychodynamics, because if you only have this utter terror of the notion of the final end of all things, the soul lasts forever, like in Christian mythology, the shades are not quite the same as souls lasting forever. So there's a different mythology here. Hades is so cold, you can't utter his name. You can't even think about him, because the Greek belief was you're calling him forward. You're calling him into the room, an early form of superstition. So they conjure up this notion of Macaraya, who's the goddess of a good death, the blessed death. And there were phrases, common phrases at the time, where you're at the bedside, like I was a year ago for my mom, who was spiraling down into dementia and madness. It was awful to see. And because I was writing the book roughly around the same time, I actually evoked her a couple of times. I said, Mom, I hope you have an easy passing. I hope you have a gracious transition. You know how we do this? I bet you've all had your versions of this. This was very Greek, that there was a gentle side to the end of life, to the passage, to the transition. So I have her coming up on the mountain, so to speak, and I'm anticipating a bit. Plug your ears if you don't want to read it yet. But what she tells him, because he's fighting so much on the mountain before he's released, he's taught. You see, there's a lot of this imagery in our iconography for 3,000 years. It's exertion, utter exhaustion, and so on and so on. Where she personifies the moment that we've all had to deal with, where you say, Will, Dennis, you've got to let go. And of course, this is one of the secrets of this whole business of hanging on to our burdens, so deeply struggling with our struggles. I had that moment when I was dealing with the Doors, writing about Jim Morrison. And they were saying it was inevitable. He knew he was going to die young. He kept telling us. And then we kept talking him out of it. No, Jim, you don't have to die at 27 like Janice and Jimmy. They actually had these discussions. So you can so deeply identify with the dark shadow, the horrific side versus the other. And I'm glad it's a breakthrough. This is what you can do as a novelist when you bring somebody out of obscurity and say, there's another reading here. So
we're so lucky you did that. You know, we had a friend, you may know Christophe Lemuel. He's the executive director of the Young Institute in LA. And he said to me one night, he said, you know, as long as it's academic, you're keeping all the things apart, all the comparisons, you're keeping it apart. It's only when you create that they come together and they come to life. And it's really a gift that somebody is deeply steeped in the myth would bring it to life through creation. So I really thank you.
Right, thank you. I was also emboldened by the recent discovery. I'm pretty sure it's very recent. It came out as a very small book. It was a lost essay of Camus that was just discovered in the archives just a few years ago. And it was, he titled this essay, Create Dangerously. Mm-hmm. Which will become one of my mottos. In other words, write about the things that matter right now in this veil of tears. Be bold. Turn that screw one more time. Say something that people may be feeling, but are, God, can I say that on paper? This kind of, so again, I just want to doff my hat to Albert there.
Well, Phil, don't you think, and I'm going to make this, let's say, our closing comments, it's the heart is an organ that draws things together and makes it whole. And if we risk following the heart, we come into a place of love. The mind really knows how to form categories and take us apart, and we're all guilty of making these separations that make the world comprehensible. But it's the wholeness that comes out of a human relationship with one another, with the natural world, with existence itself that really makes us whole. And we find ourselves in a situation like that. You can take it with you. You can go out with it. It's what I told my mom, what you told your mom. You know, there is continuity to all of existence, that we find ourselves at that moment when we're on that threshold and we can't go back. So I would like a moment of silence once again as we come to the end of a brilliant Myth Salon. I really look forward to our next time to be together, Phil. You know, and I love being closer to San Francisco than I was in LA, although I'm continually being drawn back. So let's have a moment of silence as we go forward into the rest of our lives. And here we are. Let's go forward in love, find transformation, take the path that is opening up in front of us, and trust that goodness is out there. Thank you all. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a beautiful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
you, David.
Thank you, Phil. And
Thank
all
you
of
for
you.
your input, everyone. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.